In the autumn of 1993, the most powerful woman in America, a woman who had once owned 5 mansions, a private island, a priceless collection of Islamic art, and enough cash to fund a small nation, died alone in her bedroom at Falcon Lair, her Los Angeles estate, with only her butler beside her. She was 80 years old. She weighed 67 pounds. Within days, the world would learn that she had signed a new will, one written just months before her death, in a period when, according to her own doctors, she was no longer capable of signing her own name. That will handed nearly the entirety of her $1,200 million fortune to a man who had been hired to pour her wine, press her clothes, and keep her secrets. A man named Bernard Lafferty. He had no education beyond secondary school, no professional background in finance, law, or philanthropy. He wore his blonde hair pulled into a ponytail. He favored white uniforms. And he wept publicly, extravagantly, operatically, at her funeral, in a way that made certain people in that room exchange glances they would later describe, under oath, in a court of law. The question that would consume the next decade of litigation, tabloid coverage, and quiet conversation in the drawing rooms of Newport and Beverly Hills was not simply, how did this happen? The real question, the darker one, was this. Had Doris Duke been so utterly alone that she chose to trust the one person in her life who needed her to die? This is the story of Doris Duke. She came into the world on November 22, 1912, in a New York City townhouse at 1 East 78th Street, which sat on the corner of Fifth Avenue and looked out across Central Park with the particular confidence of buildings that have never once considered what they cost. Her father was James Buchanan Duke. Tobacco, power, the kind of wealth that doesn't arrive suddenly but accumulates generation by generation, like sediment at the bottom of a very old river. James Duke had taken his father's small tobacco company in Durham, North Carolina, and through a combination of ruthless vertical integration and frankly breathtaking commercial aggression, had turned it into the American Tobacco Company. A near monopoly so vast that the United States government would eventually be compelled to break it apart under antitrust law. He had then turned his attention to electricity, helping to found what would become Duke Energy, a utility empire that still bears his name today. He endowed Duke University. He funded hospitals. He built things. He was, in the particular idiom of his era, a titan. His wife, Nainalyn Holt Inman, was a Southern widow from Georgia, elegant, emotionally distant, the product of a world where feelings were managed rather than expressed. She was, by most accounts, not a warm woman. Whether she lacked the capacity or had simply never been offered a model for it, no biographer has satisfactorily resolved. Into this household, magnificent, cold, watched by the entire social world of New York, came Doris, an only child. She was, from the first morning of her public existence, described in terms of money. The newspapers could not resist it. The New York Evening Journal called her, when she was still barely school-age, the richest little girl in the world. It was meant as a kind of fairy tale appellation. In practice, it functioned as a life sentence. Consider for a moment what it means to grow up knowing, as certainly as you know your own name, that every person who approaches you wants something from you. That the governess smiles because she is paid to smile. That the children invited to your birthday parties were selected by adults who hoped proximity to your fortune might be useful. That the boys who will one day court you are, some of them, already calculating. Doris Duke understood this before she was 10 years old. Her father understood it too. James Duke was a man who had built everything he owned from almost nothing, and he harbored a particular terror, common to self-made dynasties, that what he had created would be dismantled by those who came after him. He spent considerable energy trying to protect Doris from the very inheritance he was preparing for her. Duke Farms was her truest childhood home. Not the Fifth Avenue townhouse, not the Newport mansion Rough Point. which James Duke had purchased and expanded until it sat on the cliff's edge like a statement, but the farm. The greenhouses, the horses, the particular silence of very large private land. She was, by her own later recollection, happiest there, alone essentially, reading, writing, listening to the kind of quiet that money can buy and almost nothing else can. In 1925, when Doris was 12 years old, her father fell gravely ill. He died on October 10th of that year at his Fifth Avenue mansion with Doris present. She was 12 years old, and in that moment she became, officially, legally, undeniably, the richest child in America. Her inheritance was estimated at $100 million. In 2024 terms, that figure approaches $2 billion. She was 12. Her mother, Nanalyn, assumed control of the estate until Doris reached adulthood, a guardianship that would produce years of tension, legal disputes, and the particular bitterness that accumulates between a mother who controls and a daughter who endures. James Duke had left instructions. He had wanted Doris protected. He had imagined trustees, structures, careful management. What he could not have imagined, what no amount of legal architecture could fully prevent, was that his daughter would spend the rest of her very long life searching for the thing that all his money could not purchase for her. Someone who stayed. And yet, and this is the part that the tabloids always missed in their breathless accounting of her assets, Doris Duke was not a passive creature. She was not a tragic heiress waiting to be rescued or ruined. She was, by every account of those who knew her well, formidably intelligent, genuinely curious. She studied at Columbia University, informally, as wealthy women of her era often did, denied the full credential while receiving the education. She was a serious jazz pianist, trained and practiced, who would sit in with bands in Harlem at a time when that was considered genuinely scandalous behavior for a woman of her background. She spoke multiple languages. She developed a scholarly knowledge of Islamic art and architecture that eventually produced one of the finest private collections in the Western world, housed at Shangri-La, her estate in Honolulu, designed in consultation with the Egyptian artist Mary Hashem and completed in 1938. She was not decorative. She was not merely rich. She was a woman of serious gifts who happened to have been born into impossible circumstances, and who spent decades trying to construct a life that was authentically her own, while the world around her conspired, either through greed or simple fascination, to make that project nearly impossible. The tragedy of Doris Duke is not that she was betrayed. Many people are betrayed. The tragedy is that she almost escaped it. Several times over several decades, she came close enough to feel the warmth of something real. And then always something in her own nature or in the nature of those she chose pulled her back toward isolation. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, there was the rise, and what a rise it was. She made her social debut in January of 1930 at a ball held at the Doris Duke Mansion on Fifth Avenue, an event that the press covered with the same intensity they would today reserve for a state occasion. She was 17 years old. She wore white. The papers counted the guests, estimated the cost of the flowers, speculated about which of the assembled young men of good family might succeed in capturing her interest. Several hundred reporters gathered outside in the January cold, waiting for photographs. She found the entire spectacle, by her own later account, mildly absurd. The 1930s were, for most of America, a decade of catastrophic privation. The Depression ground across the country with particular savagery. Families lost everything. Men who had been comfortable in 1928 were selling apples on street corners in 1932. Doris Duke's fortune, meanwhile, compounded. She was not indifferent to this disparity. In later life, she would become a committed and generous philanthropist. Her foundation, eventually distributing hundreds of millions of dollars to causes ranging from child welfare to wildlife preservation to the performing arts. But in the early 1930s, she was young, she was watched, and she was trying to build something resembling a real life from the gilded cage of her circumstances. Her first marriage came in 1935. His name was James Cromwell, a socialite, a Democrat, the stepson of E.F. Hutton and stepbrother, therefore, of the equally tragic heiress Barbara Hutton. He was handsome, politically engaged, 12 years her senior. He was also, most observers now agree, primarily interested in her money. The wedding, held on February 13, 1935, at the Duke Mansion in Somerville, New Jersey, produced the kind of press coverage that today would accompany a royal marriage. The honeymoon took them around the world. It was on this trip that Doris first encountered the Islamic architecture that would define her most enduring creative project, traveling through Egypt, India, the Middle East, falling into what was not merely aesthetic appreciation, but something closer to intellectual obsession. She arrived in Hawaii in 1935 and found Black Point, on the eastern end of Oahu, a dramatic sight of lava rock above the Pacific. She bought the land. She began designing Shangri-La, the house that would become the most authentic expression of who she actually was, scholarly, precise, sensually alive, deeply serious about beauty. Cromwell, meanwhile, was growing restless. He had political ambitions. He ran for Senate from New Jersey in 1938, losing, and Doris declined to become the supportive political wife the role demanded. She was too independent, too wealthy in her own right, too unwilling to be ornamental. The marriage dissolved. Quietly by 1943. No dramatic rupture, just the slow recognition that what they had was insufficient. There were no children. Doris had, in fact, given birth in 1940, a daughter, Arden, born prematurely and surviving only 24 hours. It was a loss she carried quietly and, by all accounts, permanently. The second marriage was, in almost every respect, more interesting. His name was Porfirio Rubirosa. He was Dominican. He was a diplomat. He was spectacularly handsome, legendarily charming, and possessed of a reputation for romantic conquest that had made him genuinely famous in the gossip columns of 3 continents. He had previously been married to the Dominican dictator Trujillo's daughter. He would later marry Barbara Hutton, Doris Duke's social parallel, her shadow double in the aristocracy of American heiresses. Doris married Rubirosa in 1947. The marriage lasted 53 days. What she extracted from the arrangement, besides, reportedly, a great deal of personal pleasure, was knowledge. She was 35. She was learning, at some cost and with great intelligence, what she needed and what she could not survive. Rubirosa was beautiful and entertaining and completely incapable of fidelity. She divorced him in Paris. She gave him a check for $500,000 and a converted B-25 bomber aircraft as a parting gift. He accepted both without apparent embarrassment. She returned to her real life: the art, the farms, the music, the garden at Somerville, which covered 2,800 acres and contained, eventually, one of the finest horticultural collections in North America. Through the 1950s and 1960s, she moved between her properties, Rough Point, Shangri-La, Duke Farms, Falcon Lair, and Beverly Hills, with the purposeful restlessness of someone who has not yet found a reason to stay in one place. She surfed. She practiced yoga before it was fashionable. She took up Afro-Cuban jazz. She engaged, quietly and seriously, in intelligence work. Credible reports suggest she worked with the OSS during the Second World War, using her international connections and access in ways that remain not entirely declassified. She was not decorating a life. She was living one. She also, across these decades, developed genuine and lasting relationships with figures in the arts and entertainment world, Imelda Marcos, with whom she had a complex and ultimately damaging friendship. Marlon Brando, various jazz musicians whose names never appeared in the society pages. She preferred, increasingly, the company of people who did not need anything from her, or so she believed. Because in the 1980s, two things happened that would dismantle the careful architecture of her independence, piece by careful piece. The first was age. The second was a man named Bernard Lafferty. And the crack, when it came slowly, as cracks in old stone always do. By the late 1980s, Doris Duke was in her mid-70s, and the geography of her life had shifted. Newport society had changed. The Newport she had known, the world of white-tie dinners and Bellevue Avenue formality, had dissolved across several decades into something looser, less exclusive, eventually merely touristic. Shangri-La remained her creative sanctuary, but Hawaii required energy she was beginning to husband more carefully. Duke Farms she still loved with deep constancy. But Falcon Lair, the Beverly Hills estate perched in the hills above Sunset Boulevard, once owned by Rudolph Valentino, had become, by degrees, her primary residence. And Beverly Hills in the 1980s offered Doris Duke something Newport never quite had: proximity to a world of entertainers, eccentrics, and social climbers who were impressed by her money but did not particularly know her history. She was, in a certain sense, anonymous there, or as anonymous as a woman worth $1.2 billion could be. Her health was beginning to require management. She had undergone knee surgery in the late 1980s, a procedure whose aftermath and the painkillers prescribed for it would become a critical and contested element of everything that followed. She had always been physically robust, surfing into her 60s, maintaining the discipline of someone who took the body seriously. But the body, at 75, was beginning to have its own requirements. Into this context arrived Bernard Lafferty. He had been referred to her household through an agency sometime around 1987. He was Irish-born, from County Mayo, a Catholic boy from modest circumstances who had made his way to America and found employment as a domestic servant in wealthy households. He had worked for Peggy Lee, the singer. He had worked for others. He came with references. He was, by most accounts, immediately and instinctively skilled at reading what was needed, attentive, quiet, deferential without being servile. He seemed, to Doris Duke, genuinely devoted, and genuine devotion was, by this stage in her life, the rarest commodity she encountered. He had also, according to multiple accounts, a serious problem with alcohol. This fact would become profoundly relevant, but in the beginning it was either not apparent or not significant enough to outweigh what he offered. What he offered was presence. Doris Duke, by the late 1980s, had fewer people than she once had. Long relationships had frayed or ended. Her personal attorney, Irwin Bloom, was a trusted figure, but attorneys are professionals, not companions. Her longtime companions and friends were aging alongside her, or had already died. She had never had children. The loss of Arden, nearly 50 years before, remained a wound that never entirely closed. She had animals. She had always loved animals with an uncomplicated intensity that suggested they offered something human relationships could not. She kept camels at Duke Farms, genuinely, actual camels, along with a comprehensive menagerie. She kept a dog named Minnie with the kind of attachment usually reserved for persons. But animals, however beloved, do not manage a household, coordinate medical appointments, liaise with lawyers and accountants, remember which temperature you prefer your bath, or sit with you in the evenings when the house is large and quiet, and the world feels very far away. Bernard Lafferty did all of these things, and gradually, so gradually that no single moment can be identified as the turning point, he became indispensable. His influence expanded. Staff members who had worked for Doris for years began to notice that their access to her was being managed. Phone calls were screened. Visitors were announced or not announced, at Bernard's discretion. Medical personnel reported that he was present in rooms where, by professional convention, he had no business being. He began, reportedly, to consume alcohol on the premises, not discreetly, but in the open manner of someone who has calculated that his position is secure enough to accommodate this. Doris either did not notice, did not object, or was by this stage in a condition where her capacity to object was compromised. That question, her capacity, would become the hinge on which the entire legal future of her estate would turn. Because in 1991, Doris Duke signed a new will. The attorney who prepared it was a man named Elliot Z. Bornak, not her longtime counsel, but a lawyer introduced to her through connections that remain not entirely transparent. The will named Bernard Lafferty as the primary executor of her estate and, in a provision of stunning specificity, as a co-trustee, alongside the United States Trust Company, of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, which was to receive the bulk of her fortune. It also provided Bernard Lafferty with a salary of $500,000 per year, for life, from the estate. Then, in 1993, with her health deteriorating and her world contracting to the rooms of Falcon Lair, she signed another will. This one gave Lafferty even greater control. And it was signed, her doctors would later testify, during a period when she was heavily medicated, physically frail, and, in the clinical assessment of at least one physician, not competent to execute legal documents. Her longtime companions were excluded. Charitable organizations she had supported for decades received nothing or a fraction of what earlier wills had promised. Former friends, associates, employees of long-standing, gone. Everything flowed toward Bernard. The question of how a woman of Doris Duke's intelligence, her formidable, documented, lifelong intelligence, arrived at this point is the question that defeats simple answers. But it requires first understanding what happened in September of 1993, because before the will became a legal crisis, there was another event, a quieter one that almost no one discussed at the time, and that everyone would discuss later. A man named Eduardo Tyler died, and that was a story that had been waiting 26 years to be told. Before we return to Bernard Lafferty and the dying days of Falcon Lair, we must go back. Back 26 years. Back to a single evening in Newport that Doris Duke spent the rest of her life not discussing, and that the state of Rhode Island spent 30 years pretending had never happened. The date was October 7, 1967. Doris Duke was 54 years old, and a man named Eduardo Tyler was about to die at her front gate. Eduardo Tyler was, by every account of those who knew him, a genuinely gifted man. He was an interior decorator and set designer of real distinction. He had worked in Hollywood, on films including Pillow Talk and several other productions of the period. He was Italian-American, charming, aesthetically brilliant, and had been part of Doris Duke's intimate circle for years. He had helped design interiors at Shangri-La. He had traveled with her. He was, in the parlance of a certain social world, one of her people. On the evening of October 7, 1967, Tyler and Doris Duke were preparing to leave Rough Point together. They were going, reportedly, to dinner, or simply out. Tyler had recently informed Doris that he intended to leave her employment. He had been offered an opportunity in Hollywood that he wished to pursue. Whether this announcement had produced tension between them, no surviving witness can say with certainty. What happened next is documented in the Newport police report, which is notable primarily for what it omits rather than what it contains. Tyler opened the heavy iron gates at the entrance to Rough Point's driveway to allow the car, a Dodge station wagon, to pass through onto Bellevue Avenue. Doris Duke was at the wheel. The car moved forward. It struck Tyler, pinning him against the gates. Then, according to the police account, the car continued, accelerating. Witnesses would later say, across Bellevue Avenue and into a grove of trees on the opposite side of the road. Eduardo Tyler was dead. He was 42 years old. The Newport police investigation lasted approximately 45 minutes. 45 minutes. For the death of a man under the wheels of a car driven by one of the wealthiest women in the United States. The conclusion reached with what the 2019 reinvestigation would delicately term extraordinary swiftness, was that it was an accident. No charges were filed. No inquest was called. The case was essentially closed before the evening was over. Doris Duke was asked a small number of questions. She was reported to be distressed. She returned to the house. Tyler's family received a settlement. The amount sealed under a confidentiality agreement so comprehensive that for decades nothing was publicly known of its terms. Estimates, when the story was finally re-examined by journalists in the 1990s, and again, after a formal reinvestigation was launched by the Newport City Council in 2019, ranged from considerable to extraordinary. The mayor of Newport in 1967 was a man named John Sullivan. His brother-in-law worked for the Newport Police Department. The city was, in the autumn of tourist season, heavily dependent on the patronage and social cachet brought by the families who owned its great houses, families like the Dukes. These facts are simply facts. What conclusions to draw from them the listener must decide for themselves. What we know with certainty is this: a man died, a woman was driving, no charge was ever laid. And Doris Duke, who was, recall, a woman of serious intelligence and serious resources, spent the remaining 26 years of her life in the company of her silence about that night. Whether it was guilt that later made her vulnerable to manipulation, whether the weight of an unresolved death contributed to the isolation that defined her final years, is a question for psychologists and biographers rather than courts of law. But it is a question that hovers over everything that follows, because people who carry things tend to need someone to carry them in return. And Bernard Lafferty, whatever else he was, understood that. By the summer of 1993, Doris Duke was 80 years old, and the world she inhabited had contracted to a series of rooms. She had undergone hip replacement surgery in early 1993, a procedure that had not gone smoothly, followed by complications, followed by the aggressive administration of painkillers that multiple medical witnesses would later describe as medically inexplicable in their volume and combination. She was receiving, by some accounts, quantities of Demerol and morphine that would have incapacitated a person half her age. Her weight had fallen catastrophically. The woman who had surfed, who had practiced yoga, who had maintained the physical discipline of someone genuinely alive in her body, that woman was gone. What remained was 80 years and 67 pounds, and a great house in the hills, and Bernard Lafferty, moving through its rooms with the quiet authority of someone who has learned exactly how much is his to command. Her longtime associates began to raise alarms. Irwin Bloom, her former attorney, had by this point been largely excluded from her orbit, replaced by lawyers whose relationships with Lafferty were closer and whose relationships with Doris Duke were newer. When former friends attempted to visit, they reported that Lafferty screened access. Some were told she was resting. Others were told she was unavailable. A small number were, reportedly, told by Doris herself in terms that struck them as strange, as though the words had been placed in her mouth, that she did not wish to see them. Shandy Hefner, a woman whom Doris had legally adopted as an adult daughter in 1988, in one of the more extraordinary impulsive decisions of her life, apparently believing Hefner to be a reincarnation of the child Arden she had lost in 1940, had been cut off entirely. The adoption would be legally challenged by Doris herself before her death, a reversal she initiated in 1992 under circumstances that Hefner's lawyers would later claim were orchestrated by Lafferty. The household staff, meanwhile, lived in a state of anxious compliance. Those who expressed concern about the medications, about Lafferty's drinking, about the state of Doris Duke's health, found themselves dismissed. One nurse, in later sworn testimony, described observing Lafferty administer medications to Doris Duke in a manner inconsistent with her prescribed dosages. She reported it. She was fired. And then on October 28, 1993, Doris Duke died. The official cause of death was listed as a stroke, a cerebrovascular accident, in the clinical language of the death certificate, signed by Dr. Charles Kivovitz, Doris Duke's physician. Dr. Kivovitz had also been the physician who, in the final months of her life, had prescribed the medications that multiple other physicians would later describe as inexplicably excessive. He had signed the death certificate without requesting an autopsy. He had also been present, along with Bernard Lafferty, in the room when several key documents were signed. These are facts, simply facts. Bernard Lafferty was at her bedside when she died. He wept when she died. He wept at the funeral, openly and at length, in the particular manner of a man auditioning grief for an audience. The body was cremated, also without autopsy, and her ashes were scattered per her instructions on the beach at Duke Farms. The will was filed, and the world learned what Bernard Lafferty had inherited. The reaction was, to use the most measured available term, considerable. Within weeks of the will being filed, the legal challenges began accumulating with the urgency of a dam breaking. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, the institution meant to receive the bulk of her fortune, found itself in the peculiar position of having Bernard Lafferty as its co-trustee and executor, drawing his $500,000 annual salary, while simultaneously being the subject of challenges from virtually every quarter of her former life. Former employees sued. Charities that had been promised bequests and received nothing sued. Shandy Hefner, the adult daughter, the discarded reincarnation, sued. The attorneys who had been displaced by the lawyers who drafted the final will sued. People who had known Doris Duke for 30 years came forward with affidavits describing a woman who, in her final months, had been isolated, over-medicated, and in no condition to direct the distribution of $1,200 million. The United States Trust Company, designated as co-trustee alongside Lafferty, filed its own petition with the New York Surrogates Court in 1995, seeking to have Lafferty removed as executor. Their filing contained a passage that became, in the coverage of this case, something close to notorious. It described Bernard Lafferty as a man who was dishonest, manipulative, given to intoxication, and unfit to manage the affairs of an estate of this magnitude. They were his co-trustees. This was their assessment of him. The deposition testimony that emerged from the discovery process was, in places, genuinely disturbing. Multiple witnesses described Lafferty's drinking, not occasional, not social, but the continuous, functional drinking of someone who has incorporated alcohol into the basic operation of their day. Staff members described finding bottles hidden in rooms throughout Falcon Lair. One former housekeeper testified that she had observed Lafferty drinking from a bottle at 11 in the morning while coordinating Doris Duke's medical care. A physician who had treated Doris Duke in her final months testified that the combination and quantity of medication she had been administered was, in his professional view, inconsistent with her diagnosed conditions and inconsistent with any standard of responsible pain management. The question of whether Doris Duke had been, in the clinical sense, competent to execute the documents she signed in 1991 and 1993 was addressed by multiple expert witnesses. The consensus, cautiously but consistently expressed, was that she had not been. That the woman who signed those documents was not, in any legally meaningful sense, the woman who had spent 80 years building and managing and protecting one of the great private fortunes in American history. Bernard Lafferty, in the meantime, was living in the manner of a man who had no particular anxiety about the future. He had moved into Falcon Lair. He had retained its staff. He had begun receiving his $500,000 annual salary. He was photographed at social events in Beverly Hills, his blonde ponytail a recognizable signature, attended by a level of attention appropriate to someone who controlled access to one of the largest charitable foundations in America. He gave interviews. In them he was soft-spoken, devoted, tearful when discussing Doris. He described himself as her most loyal servant, her truest companion, the one person who had genuinely loved her, Some people believed him. Most people did not. What makes this case resist the simple narrative of a predator and a victim? And what makes it, finally, more interesting and more devastating than that simple narrative, is the question of what Doris Duke actually wanted. Because there is another version of these events. In this version, Doris Duke, a woman who had spent 80 years being managed, assessed, pursued, and disappointed by people who wanted her money, made a deliberate choice, in full knowledge of what she was doing, to leave her fortune to the one person in her life who she felt had actually shown up for her. Not for her money, not for her name, not for her connections, but for her. In this version, Bernard Lafferty was not a predator. He was, in his imperfect and alcoholic and probably self-interested way, genuinely present. And for a woman who had been as comprehensively alone as Doris Duke, presence, even imperfect, even compromised presence, was worth more than $1,200 million. In this version, the true scandal is not what Bernard Lafferty did to Doris Duke. It is what the world, the lawyers, the charitable institutions, the former friends, the distant relatives, did to her memory, once she was gone, in their rush to contest a will that threatened their interests. Both versions contain truth. That is the thing about Doris Duke. That is the thing about all the most compelling stories. They resist resolution. The legal proceedings surrounding the estate of Doris Duke would continue, in various forms, for the better part of a decade. In 1995, Bernard Lafferty reached a settlement with the United States Trust Company and the various parties challenging his role as executor. The exact terms were sealed, but what emerged publicly was this. Lafferty retained his $500,000 annual salary for life. He relinquished day-to-day control of the estate's charitable operations. He was no longer the primary executor in any meaningful functional sense, though he retained the title. He had won, and he had lost, and the winning and the losing were, in his case, becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from one another. Because Bernard Lafferty, freed from the necessity of managing a billion-dollar estate, was not a man who flourished in leisure. He continued to drink. He continued to live at Falcon Lair for a period, and then, as the legal constraints around the estate tightened elsewhere, in accommodation funded by his salary, he gave occasional interviews. He maintained, to the end, the position that he had loved Doris Duke truly and been her most faithful servant. Whether this was self-deception or genuine belief or simple performance, those who met him in his final years could not agree. On September 4, 1996, Bernard Lafferty was found dead in his home in Los Angeles. He was 51 years old. The cause of death was heart failure, almost certainly accelerated by his chronic alcohol consumption. He had lived approximately 2 years and 10 months after the death of Doris Duke. He had received, in that time, approximately $1.4 million from her estate. He died, by all accounts, unhappy. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, once the legal fog cleared, became one of the most significant philanthropic institutions in the United States. By the time of its major distributions in the late 1990s and 2000s, it had dispensed hundreds of millions of dollars across child welfare, the performing arts, wildlife preservation, and environmental conservation. Rough Point was donated to the Newport Restoration Foundation, an organization Doris herself had founded in 1968, in one of the great acts of architectural preservation in American history, which had saved dozens of colonial-era buildings in Newport from demolition, and opened to the public as a house museum. Shangri-La, in Honolulu, became the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art, a research center and museum, open by appointment, containing one of the finest collections of Islamic decorative art in the Western world. It is, of all the things she left behind, the one that most closely resembles what she actually was. Serious, exquisite, deeply informed, not interested in your approval. Duke Farms in New Jersey became an environmental education center and nature preserve. Her animals were cared for. Her music was catalogued. Her papers, the diaries, the correspondence, the architectural drawings for Shangri-La were preserved. Shandy Hefner, the adopted daughter, eventually reached her own settlement with the estate. The terms were not disclosed. She disappeared from the public record with the efficiency of someone who has taken a very large check and decided that was probably enough. Dr. Charles Kivovitz, the physician who had signed the death certificate, faced scrutiny from the California Medical Board. The investigation was eventually closed without formal disciplinary action. He continued to practice. The Newport reinvestigation of Eduardo Tyler's death, opened formally by the City Council in 2019, following the publication of a book by journalist Randy Jurgensen and former NYPD detective Jerry Schmetterer, concluded in 2021. It found that the original investigation had been severely flawed and that questions about the circumstances of Tyler's death remained unanswered. No charge was possible, of course. Doris Duke had been dead for nearly 30 years. But the record at least had been corrected. Eduardo Tyler's name is now slightly better remembered than it was. That is something. The estate, the lawsuits, the settlements, the foundations, the house museums. The slow, institutional digestion of one extraordinary life into a series of endowments and visiting hours and curatorial decisions made by committees. This is what happens after. This is what happens to all of them, eventually, to all the great fortunes and the great names and the great houses. They become public. They become educational. They become, in the most polite possible sense of the word, tamed. But before we close, before we walk out of Rough Point and past those iron gates on Bellevue Avenue and back into the ordinary world, there is one more thing to be said. The most important thing. We tell ourselves when we encounter stories like this one that the lesson is obvious. That wealth corrupts. That isolation destroys. That a woman who had everything was, in the end, left with nothing. We reach for the comfortable moral money can't buy happiness, and we feel briefly wise, and then we forget, and nothing changes. But that is not what this story is about. Doris Duke was not destroyed by her wealth. She was destroyed by something far more common, far more democratic, far more available to all of us regardless of our bank balances. She was destroyed by the particular hunger for proof of love. Consider the full arc of her life. A father who protected her because he feared she would be exploited, and in protecting her, taught her that connection was something that had to be defended against, not opened toward. A mother who managed her rather than loved her. A social world that treated her not as a person but as a figure, an object of fascination, calculation, and aspiration. Every relationship she formed, every marriage, every friendship, every adoption, took place against the constant background noise of a question she could never fully silence. Do you want me, or do you want what I have? And the tragedy, the real, specific, heartbreaking tragedy, is that she was, by all evidence, a woman capable of genuine love. Her commitment to Shangri-La was love. Her decades of work at Duke Farms was love. Her passion for music, for jazz, for beauty, for the natural world, these were not the gestures of an empty person. They were the expressions of a woman with a rich and serious inner life who simply could not find a human context spacious enough to contain it. Bernard Lafferty, whatever else he was, gave her something that $1,200 million and 5 estates and a century of social prominence had not reliably provided. He gave her the daily embodied experience of being attended to, not admired, not assessed, not courted or managed or litigated against, simply attended to. That this came at a cost she may not have been fully able to calculate in her final years. That the man attending to her was also, in all likelihood, managing her toward a conclusion that benefited him, does not entirely negate what she found in it. Because the unbearable truth at the center of the Doris Duke story is not that she was foolish. It is that she was human, profoundly, simply, expensively human. We build legal structures to protect inheritances. We draft wills and codicils and trusts and amendments, and we hire attorneys to draft them and accountants to administer them and courts to adjudicate them. We treat the distribution of wealth as the most serious and consequential thing a dying person does. And perhaps it is. But Doris Duke's story suggests that what we have failed to build, what no legal document, however carefully drafted, can provide, is a structure for protecting the dying from their own loneliness. She was 80 years old and she weighed 67 pounds, and she was in a house in the hills above Beverly Hills, and the person sitting with her was a man who needed her to die. And she may have known that. She was, after all, a woman who had understood very young that people often needed something from her. Perhaps the saddest possibility of all, the one that keeps this story alive, that makes it something more than a cautionary tale about Butler and Billionaire, is this. Perhaps she signed those papers anyway, not because she was deceived, but because after 80 years of being the richest woman in the room, she had decided that this, at least, was a transaction she understood. She would give him everything, and in return, he would stay. She spent her whole life trying to determine what she was worth to the people who said they loved her. In the end, the answer was $1.2 billion, and she already knew that.